When you walk round Highgrove Garden with King Charles, you very quickly realise his passion, not just for plants and gardening, but also for designing and creating gardens. I had the fantastic experience of writing a book with the then Prince Charles about Highgrove Gardens about 10 years ago, and I visited it regularly throughout the year and talked extensively to Debs, who was then the head gardener, and also chatted to the King about the garden, how they made it, their plans and aspects like that. And it was really interesting to go back recently, 10 years on, and just see what had changed. Now, Prince Charles bought it, Highgrove, about in the early 80s when he was about 33. And it was unusual in that he actually bought and chose it as opposed to inherited it. And you might wonder, why did he choose Highgrove? He could have had virtually any property on the market. But there were three key things, I think, that persuaded him. One was the wonderful parkland that surrounded the house. This is what they call wood pastures. So it traditionally would have been grazed for hundreds of years. And then you have nice ancient trees within the pasture that they used for the timber. They would pollard them or coppice them at regular intervals. Another aspect was a fantastic walled garden. Now, it has been known that actually pigs were in it quite recently, just before Prince Charles bought it, and also part of the wall was fallen down. But it was a great space potentially. And then there was a fantastic Lebanon cedar, which sadly now has had to go, but that was in front of the house and looked remarkable. And maybe the fact that there wasn't a great garden there was one of its chief selling points. Here he had something that he could grasp with both hands and really put his stamp on it, and he certainly has done that. I knew Highgrove as a young teenager. They had Pony Club camp there, and that was my first experience of seeing Highgrove. It quickly becomes apparent that King Charles is very much hands-on. When he acquired the house, he would come back from busy days in London, suited and booted. He'd jump out of the car, race into the house, put on his wellies, and he'd get out into the garden. And young gardeners who worked with him at that time said if they were clearing underneath the Japanese larch plantation, removing all the brambles and things like that, he, the king, or then prince, would quickly outpace them, and he'd be at it, be full on it, and they would be quite exhausted trying to keep up with him. He is physically fit, keen, and loves doing hard work. Highgrove Gardens are not just a rich man's plaything. He uses the gardens as a headquarters of some of his charities. He raises huge amounts of money for his charities, and he promotes causes about the environment mainly that he is really passionate about. Rare breeds of fruit trees that are dying out, the fact that meadows are being eroded, and he's promoting the use and growing of wildflower meadows. He encourages apprentices. He really uses it as a hub for all the things about the environment for which he is passionate about. And also, surprisingly, you might think there's not many things that the average gardener can take away from Highgrove. But I would disagree there strongly. You can see that there are many ideas and techniques that he uses and promotes that you can take away and use in your own garden. So come and look at some of the things that he's done there. Perhaps one of the more surprising things is the treatment of the front drive at Highgrove. He has a lovely broad green stripe running up the middle, and it's a nice meandering gentle straight. No hard and fast formality or tarmac or brick pavers. It's just very soft, very natural and beautiful. Highgrove is most famous probably for its wonderful meadows. Now, you don't need rolling acres. You can just do it in a very small patch. And the beauty of it is that it changes every year. You can pep it up. You don't have to plant 3,000 clematis like His Majesty has done over the last years, but you can just pep it up as much or as little as you like, and it is a wonderful dynamic space. At Highgrove they have a fantastic chicken house, and it's even designed with a little seat in the back of the house, so you can go and spend time there, peace and tranquility, watching the chickens. What could be nicer? They're fascinating birds. The king is very keen on producing his own food, and if you can have a few chickens and have your own eggs, the better it is for all. The wall garden at Highgrove is one of the gardens that the public love the most, and it is a magnificent space. They use a lot of hazel wands to train the sweet peas and peas, and they also mix herbaceous plants within the vegetables to really up the ante. The interesting thing about wall gardens is they are a lot warmer and protected. They reckon it can be 4 degrees warmer than the outside space because it's so sheltered. So if you can have a very sheltered, sunny space for your vegetables, it does make a lot of difference. And also the walls help keep out some of those pesky pests like rabbits. The apple arches are wonderful, and along the bottom of them they grow Rosa ruguginosa. And the interesting thing about this rose is the foliage actually smells of apples. And many visitors have been heard to say, wow, you can even smell the apples as you walk underneath it. Even the paved areas at Highgrove are often softened up. The paving, instead of being laid close butted or with a 10mm gap, is mainly laid with a 35mm gap, and it was often laid by Fred Inn, who worked there for many years. And instead of filling the joints with cement and sand, they actually put soil within those big gaps, and plants are encouraged to self-seed among it. So instead of looking like a hard space, it looks a really soft space. Sometimes you get really great surprises when you allow things to self-seed, like this magnificent Ferula communis, which I've got growing here. But I do love gardening with self-seeding plants because you can weed out what you don't want, the pernicious weeds, and keep what you do. And again, it keeps the space very dynamic. King Charles is very keen on his honey, and what wonderful stuff it is too, the Highgrove honey. He has a fine Slovenian bee house, which you can actually tend inside. So when you're working the hives and things like that, you're actually in the dry, which is lovely. He's also been given some beautiful ornate ones. So it's really worth getting into bees if you've got the time, because having your own honey and just watching them in the garden is fantastic. The then Prince laid out the Highgrove gardens in a way that you could actually walk around them and view certain aspects of the garden as you went round. And he likes to frame many of them views, often with gates. A lot of the gates were designed by Willie Bertram, and Willie would sketch up rough ideas and then he'd work on it with the then Prince. And I think framing entrances in a garden is a lovely thing to do. It really highlights the transition from one space to another. And the then Prince came at it really as an artist, as a watercolour painter, because he liked to view paintings within the frame of the garden walk. And I think that's a lovely way to look at a garden. Most of us love privacy, and the king has precious little of it. So he discussed with Willie Bertram, the architect, ways to give himself some privacy when using his terrace, perhaps for sketching or whatever. So Willie Bertram came up with the idea of little pepper pot lodges on the end, like overcoats, to give him that bit of cover while maybe he was doing a watercolour or something like that. And as always, Willie would sketch ideas very informally, very sketchily, and then the Prince then would put his input into it and then refine the design together and then come up with something fantastic. And concerning the little obelisk on the top, they weren't quite sure how big to make it, so they decided to make wooden templates of various different sizes and just try them in position to see which one looks best. And I often use this technique when you're not sure if you've got the scale quite right. It's so worthwhile just trying it out with a bit of cardboard or something like that, and then you instantly know which one works best. The sanctuary at Highgrove is King Charles's private space. There are no keys, just a secret way of opening it, and he is the only person who uses it. We made our mud hut from soil from the adjoining field, as they did at Highgrove. It's actually really simple to make, and they do last surprisingly long. We've still got mud buildings around today which were built in medieval times. So maybe that's a great summer project for you and the family. The King has used colour to great effect at Highgrove. There are seats that are in the late Queen Mother's racing colour, and he used yellow to great effect on the north side of the wonderful yew hedges. Yellow is one of my favourite colours. So I think it's really worth being bold with colour, experimenting and giving your garden its own special identity. The King loves avenues and has planted several. John White, who was head of Westonbirt, which is next door to Highgrove, helped him plan many. And here the sketches he's done show how an avenue develops over 100 years into a lovely, wonderful wall of wood. Now, I don't think we are really suitable for avenues here, but having seen how the King uses them at Highgrove, I have used them on other people's gardens because I do think they are fantastic living structures. The King has employed quite a large scale in places at Highgrove, such as in this lovely rock edifice with the amazing gunnerer pouring out of the top. Don't be afraid to up the scale. If you use a large scale urn or wide steps in quite a small space, it really does help up the ante. The King has planted many trees, especially at Highgrove. The Arboretum is one of the crowning glories. John White helped him plan it, and strangely the soil in the Arboretum is a forest marble, which is a more acid sandy soil, quite different from the rest of the soil at Highgrove, which is a more alkaline limestone. And so he selected his trees depending on the soil, ones that would go with the soil. The King wanted autumn colour and spring colour. He loves Japanese acers and he loves cherries, and they both do really well on that sandy, slightly acid soil. And what I think is really clever is instead of just planting hundreds of different species of trees, giving a very dolly mixture effect, the whole planting design was very restrained. They just kept a certain species and they would have a clump of the same species together, and they kept to just cherries and acers in the main, with a view to thinning out the clumps later on as the trees grew on. And I think when you're designing an arboretum, especially if it's in a fairly small space, which that one is, to be restricted in your choice and not being tempted to just throw a whole load of different trees in really works very well. King Charles loves Topia and he's used it to great effect throughout his garden, and you see he was always developing more of it. He also uses box a lot. He has tried different substitutes such as Teucrium cross lysergis, which he had in the wall garden, but he's now put box back. He's also used euonymus and tried that out, but he's recently planted a lot of blight resistant varieties such as John Baldwin and Faulkner, and they're both doing really well. There are many blight resistant varieties now on the market. He inevitably will get box moth, I would think, but there are biopesticides which are organically improved which can combat this. So I think he uses the box and the yew together in his topiary with a lighter, brighter and the darker green to great effect. The King is very keen on making his own compost, and Brian Corr, who's recently become the new head gardener or head of gardens there, is extremely keen on making compost, and he's increased the numbers of bins. They do actually, though, it was previously an enclosed system, so they just tried to keep everything at Highgrove with stuff they produced there. They now are bringing in digestate, which is what I'm standing on and which I love, and the cows love basking in the sun on. And this is wonderful organic matter, and it's a byproduct of producing gas for energy, and it's weed free. They also, so now Brian has changed the policy somewhat as he's really mulching the gardens quite heavily to help keep the weeds down. They've also purchased a root wave machine which sends an electronic current down through the plant and actually zaps or boils the root. So that is really good for pernicious perennial weeds such as bindweed, nettles and things like that. So just try doing more and more of your own compost. If you can get digestate or any other economical organic sort of mulch, it's really worth doing. The hedges at Highgrove, I think, are the crowning glory. The Marchioness of Salisbury, or Molly Salisbury, helped lay out the plan of the hedges way back when he initially started. The then Prince was very keen on privacy because it was the height of the time with Diana. And so he actually wanted to plant a Leyland cypress hedge because he was impatient to get his privacy. But Molly Salisbury persuaded him to go for yew, which he did do. And actually yew does go way, way faster than people think. Then a few years later, the Prince brought in Roy Strong, Sir Roy Strong, and Roy Strong came down, eyed all up the hedges and said to him, "I'm sorry, sir, but you've got to remove some of the hedges and change the layout because they are not perpendicular to the building, they're not parallel, they're not square, and it's never going to look right." Now, luckily, King Charles actually ignored this advice and he kept the hedges as they are. And I think that's interesting to see because when you wander around today, there's no way that you notice they're slightly out of true or they're not perpendicular or parallel. And the eye automatically deceives you on many things like this. But what Roy Strong did do, which I think is fantastic, he did the outline design for shaping and topiarizing the hedges. And then he came with a helper. The two of them in one day actually cut the embryonic forms into the 1.8 metre high hedge or whatever it was, and it's been slowly built on over the years, and now I think they just look truly amazing, and they are my very favourite feature of the garden. When the King first moved into Highgrove, you could hear the road noise from the Bath Road in the garden. But then over subsequent years, as he let the meadow develop, which brought in insects, which brought in birds, and he planted woodland and tree, which gave screen and nesting sites for the birds, the bird population really dramatically raised. And of course, the water helps bring in birds as well. So by doing all these things, you're totally unaware of the road noise now, and that is in the main due to the bird song which is generated through the habitats created. And talking to a sound engineer recently, they said that actually one of the most efficient ways to combat road noise is to encourage bird populations because they do far more than running water or anything else. And I think that's such a lovely, neat trick that helps you, that helps the birds, that helps the environment. So let's go for a better environment for the birds. I hope you've managed to glean a few ideas from this. Let's hope we see the King's great passion for gardens, the environment and gardening influence us all more and more. Long live the King!